He sat quietly in the back row, his weathered hands folded in his lap like pages of an old book that had been read countless times. No uniform adorned his shoulders. The navy blue fabric with its gleaming badges was now just a memory hanging in his closet at home. No hat sat atop his silver hair, which had grown thin over the decades of service. Just his old black shoes, polished that morning out of habit, and the quiet dignity that comes from 34 years of answered calls, solved cases, and lives touched. The annual Medal of Honor ceremony was in full swing around him. The department's finest were being recognized, their names called with pride, their achievements read aloud to a room full of applause. The current chief stood at the podium, his voice carrying across the decorated hall where banners hung from the ceiling, and photographs of fallen officers lined the walls like silent sentinels. Officer Daniel McRae hadn't been invited to this ceremony. His retirement party 3 years ago had been small, understated. A few handshakes, a plaque, and the standard speech about years of dedicated service. But something had drawn him here today. Perhaps the same instinct that had guided him through dark alleys and dangerous situations throughout his career. He remembered his first day on the force, 37 years ago. The nervous excitement, the weight of the badge, the solemn oath to serve and protect. He remembered his first arrest, his first rescue, his first time holding a grieving family member's hand. The memories flickered through his mind like scenes from a movie he'd watched too many times. But the years had a way of making heroes into footnotes, and active duty had a way of making retired officers feel invisible. The younger generation didn't know his stories, didn't remember the cases that had kept him awake at night, the victories that had made him proud to wear the badge. As he sat there, listening to the ceremony unfold, a young officer, probably fresh out of the academy, with pressed uniform and eager eyes, spotted him. The officer leaned over to whisper something to another colleague, then another. The whispers spread like ripples in a pond, eventually reaching the ears of the current chief. Chief Rodriguez paused in his speech, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on the lone figure in the back row. There was a moment of recognition, a flash of something that might have been embarrassment or confusion. The chief stepped down from the podium and walked through the crowd, his footsteps echoing in the suddenly quiet room. "Excuse me, sir," the chief said, his voice carrying a tone of polite authority. "This ceremony is for active members only. I'm going to have to ask you to leave." The words hung in the air like smoke from a discharged weapon. No thank you for your service. No acknowledgement of the decades spent in uniform. No handshake or warm smile. Just the cold bureaucratic dismissal that cut deeper than any physical wound. Officer McRae looked up, his blue eyes meeting the chief's gaze. There was no anger there, no indignation. Just the quiet acceptance of a man who had learned long ago that life doesn't always reward those who deserve it most. He nodded slowly, understanding that he was no longer part of this brotherhood he had served so faithfully. He stood up slowly, his joints protesting after too many years of chasing suspects, lifting accident victims, and standing guard over crime scenes. His back was hunched now, curved by the weight of time and the physical demands of a career spent protecting others. His knees were stiff, marked by old injuries from foot pursuits and the countless times he'd knelt beside someone in need. As he rose, the room seemed to grow larger around him. The conversations continued. The ceremony rolled on, but he felt smaller somehow, diminished by the dismissal. He turned toward the exit, his movement careful and measured. like a man walking through a minefield of his own memories. The active officers returned to their conversations, their attention already shifting back to the ceremony. Awards were being called, names were being read, and life was moving forward without him. The sound of applause filled the air, but none of it was for him. He was becoming invisible, fading into the background like an old photograph left too long in the sun. No one clapped as he walked toward the door. No one made eye contact. He was a ghost in his own house, a stranger in the place he had once called home. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent his career making others feel safe, but now he was the one being made to feel unwelcome. His footsteps echoed in the suddenly cavernous room, each one taking him further from the life he had known, the identity he had carried for so long. He reached into his pocket and touched the small worn badge he still carried. Not his official one, but a replica his daughter had given him years ago. It was a reminder of who he had been, who he still was, even if no one else remembered. The exit door loomed ahead, a portal back to the world of the forgotten, the retired, the has-beens. He was almost there, almost free from the awkwardness and the whispers, when something stopped him cold. A child's voice, clear and bright as a bell on a quiet morning, cut through the murmur of conversation and ceremony like a knife through silk. "Why is he leaving?" The words seemed to freeze time itself. Heads turned in unison, conversations stopped mid-sentence, and even the chief paused in his presentation. The sound came from somewhere in the middle of the room, where families of officers sat in their best clothes, proud and beaming. A little girl stood up from her seat, her small frame dwarfed by the adults around her. She wore a white dress with tiny flowers embroidered along the hem, and her dark hair was pulled back with a ribbon that matched her patent leather shoes. She looked no older than 10, with wide brown eyes that held the kind of innocence that sees the world in simple terms of right and wrong. "That's Officer McRae," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent room. "He saved my mom's life." The words hit the assembly like a thunderclap. The dead silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the faint hum of the air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic outside. Chief Rodriguez froze mid-sentence, his prepared remarks dying on his lips. The officers looked at each other with expressions of dawning realization and growing shame. 10 years ago," the little girl continued, seemingly unaware of the impact her words were having. "Before I was born, he pulled her out of a burning car." Officer McRae stopped walking, his hand still on the door handle. He turned slowly, his eyes searching the crowd for the source of the voice. He saw her then, this small angel in white who had just changed everything with a few simple words. The chief's face turned pale as the memory came flooding back. How could he have forgotten? How could any of them have forgotten? The incident had been front-page news, the stuff of local legend. A woman, 8 months pregnant, trapped in an overturned car that had burst into flames after a collision with a drunk driver. The fire department had been delayed by traffic, and the other officers on the scene had been setting up a perimeter, waiting for the professionals to arrive. But McRae hadn't waited. He never waited when lives were at stake. A rookie officer had tried to stop him, grabbing his arm and shouting about protocol and safety. But McRae had shaken him off with the kind of determination that comes from knowing exactly what needs to be done. He had gone into that burning car not once, but twice. First for the mother, carrying her to safety despite the flames licking at his uniform. And then back again for the unborn child, when the mother begged him to save her baby. The rescue had been miraculous. Both mother and child had survived, though the little girl had been born premature and spent her first weeks in the hospital. The incident had made McRae a local hero, earning him commendations and the respect of his peers. Newspapers had run the story, television stations had interviewed him, and the department had held a special ceremony in his honor. But that was 10 years ago, and 10 years can be a lifetime in a profession where heroes are made and forgotten with each passing day. The active officers had moved on to new cases, new challenges, new heroes. The retired ones had faded into the background, their stories becoming footnotes in the department's history. Now, as the chief stood there remembering, he felt the weight of his mistake settling on his shoulders like a heavy coat. This wasn't just any retired officer they were dismissing. This was Daniel McRae, the man who had risked everything to save a pregnant woman and her unborn child. This was the officer who had embodied everything their department stood for. Officer McRae stood frozen by the door, his mind racing as he tried to process what was happening. He had no idea who the little girl was, no memory of her face or her family. The rescue had been one of many in his career, filed away in his memory, alongside countless other calls, other saves, other moments when he had been in the right place at the right time. But she remembered. This child, who hadn't even been born when he risked his life, knew his name and his story. She had grown up hearing about the officer who had saved her mother's life, who had made it possible for her to exist in this world. The little girl stepped out from between the chairs, her small hand smoothing down her white dress. She walked toward McRae with the kind of confidence that only children possess, unaware of the social boundaries and protocols that kept adults at a distance. "My mom says I wouldn't be here if it weren't for you," she said, looking up at him with those wide brown eyes. "She tells me about you all the time, about how brave you were, how you didn't think about yourself, just about saving us." The room remained silent, every person transfixed by the scene unfolding before them. Here was a living reminder of why they had all chosen this profession, why they wore the badge, why they put their lives on the line every single day. Here was proof that their work mattered, that their sacrifices had meaning, that heroes were real and walking among them. McRae knelt down slowly, his old knees protesting, until he was at eye level with the little girl. His voice was thick with emotion when he spoke. "What's your name, sweetheart?" "Emma," she replied. "Emma Rodriguez." The chief's sharp intake of breath was audible across the room. Rodriguez, his own last name. This was his niece, his sister's daughter, the sister who had been saved by McRae 10 years ago, who had gone on to marry and have a family, who had named her daughter after the officer who had given her a second chance at life. How could he have forgotten? How could he have failed to make the connection? His own family owed their existence to the man he had just asked to leave. The room began to stir as the reality of the situation sank in. Officers who had been part of the original rescue started to remember, their faces showing a mixture of shame and recognition. The newer officers, who had only heard the story in passing, began to understand the magnitude of what had just happened. Emma reached out and took McRae's weathered hand in her small, soft one. The contrast was striking, his hand scarred by years of service, hers unmarked by time or hardship. But in that moment, they were connected by something deeper than blood or duty. They were connected by the simple act of one human being saving another, and the ripple effects that act had created. "Thank you," Emma said simply, "for everything. For my mom, for me, for our whole family." The room erupted. Every officer, every family member, every person in that hall stood up as one. The applause started slowly, from the officers who remembered the original incident, then spread like wildfire through the crowd. Even the ones who had asked him to leave, even the ones who had whispered about his presence, were now on their feet, clapping with the fervor of the converted. Chief Rodriguez walked across the room, his face a mask of shame and regret. He reached McRae and the little girl, his own eye wet with unshed tears. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the room. "We forgot," he said simply. "That's on us. That's on me. We forgot who you are, what you've done, what you represent. There's no excuse for that." McRae stood up slowly, Emma's hand still in his. He looked at the chief, at the room full of people applauding, at the little girl who had just changed everything with her simple words. A smile spread across his weathered face, the kind of smile that comes from deep within, from a place of peace and understanding. "I didn't come for the applause," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the room. "I came because this is still my family, even if I'm not wearing the uniform anymore. I came because I still believe in what we do, what you do, every day." The chief's voice was thick with emotion. "Then let us give it anyway. Let us give you what you deserve, what we should have given you from the moment you walked in here. And for the first time in years, for the first time since his retirement, Officer Daniel McRae felt like he was home again." The applause continued, growing stronger rather than weaker, as if the room was trying to make up for years of forgotten recognition with a single sustained moment of appreciation. Emma stayed by his side, her small hand in his large one, her presence a reminder that the work they did mattered, that the sacrifices they made had meaning, that the lives they touched went on to touch other lives in ways they might never fully understand. The ceremony continued, but it was different now. The awards that were given carried more weight. The speeches that were made held more meaning, and the applause that filled the room sounded more genuine. It was as if Emma's simple words had reminded everyone why they were there, why they had chosen this profession, why they continued to serve despite the dangers and the difficulties. Later that evening, as the ceremony wound down and people began to leave, a local reporter who had been covering the event approached McRae. She had witnessed the entire scene, had seen the transformation that had taken place in that room. "Officer McRae," she said, "I'd like to write about what happened here today. Would you be willing to share your story?" McRae looked down at Emma, who was still by his side, and then back at the reporter. "It's not my story," he said quietly. "It's hers. It's all of theirs. I just happened to be in the right place at the right time." The reporter smiled. "But that's what makes it worth telling." The next day, the story appeared in the local newspaper under the headline, "He didn't need a medal. He raised a generation." The article told the story of the ceremony, of the little girl who had stood up for a forgotten hero, of the room full of officers who had remembered why they became cops in the first place. But the real story wasn't in the newspaper. It was in the photograph that ran alongside the article, a picture of Officer McRae standing with Emma, her small hand in his, both of them smiling at the camera. It was a picture that captured something essential about the nature of heroism, about the connections that bind us together, about the way one life can touch another in ways that echo through generations. The photograph became something of a local legend itself. It was shared on social media, posted on bulletin boards, and framed on office walls. But for Emma and her family, it was simply a reminder of the man who had made their lives possible, who had shown them that heroes were real, and that they walked among us every day. And for Officer McRae, it was a reminder that retirement didn't mean the end of service, that the badge might be put away, but the calling remained, that the lives he had touched would continue to touch others long after he was gone. The ceremony that day had been about honoring heroes, but it had become something more, a reminder that heroism isn't always about the moment of action, but about the lifetime of consequences that follow. It was about the way a single act of courage can ripple through time, creating waves of impact that reach far beyond what the original actor could ever imagine. Emma Rodriguez would grow up knowing that heroes were real. She would carry with her the story of Officer McRae, would tell it to her own children someday, would pass on the understanding that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they choose to put others before themselves. And in a world that often seems short on heroes, that knowledge would be a gift beyond measure, a reminder that the best of humanity lives on in the simple act of one person reaching out to save another, and in the gratitude that follows that act like sunlight after a storm.